Hello everyone, thank you for watching. We're looking down, this is the visible satellite imagery here across the eastern Pacific, the western third of the United States here. Kind of similar, I think, to last week. Not a lot to talk about here across the western U.S. in terms of immediate weather. If we kind of look closely at Montana here, you can see the clouds coming from north to south, from the top of the image down through the south out of Canada here. So you can imagine that if we're bringing air mass from Canada into Montana, it's going to be colder than average. So looking at some colder temperatures here across northwest Montana here this Wednesday afternoon, some snow showers reported in the Great Falls area. That's really it in terms of the weather to talk about. Some snow and rain showers here in eastern Idaho as far as the western U.S., but anywhere west or south of that, dealing with more spring-like weather finally here in mid-April. Just some kind of high, wispy cirrus clouds over California. That's kind of indicative of fair weather anyway. It's kind of a nice day unfolding, maybe a little bit more typical, more spring-like, better for getting outside. As I've made these videos, over the last, a week ago, the week before that, etc., there has been always kind of this next system on the horizon. One reason for that is we're just coming out of an El Nino water year. We're still in El Nino today. We'll take a look at where that's going at the end of the video. But that keeps momentum in the atmosphere, particularly for the western U.S., where we have system after system to talk about. And that's just been the case, even with some of these weaker systems that have come through. Just this past weekend, 15th, 16th, 17th of April here, just here this week, we had more rainfall come through parts of coastal California, maybe just a little bit more than we expected. Central Valley had anywhere from half an inch of rainfall up toward an inch of rainfall in some areas in the Central and San Joaquin Valley. The Santa Barbara area down here in Southern California, I think, got a little bit more precipitation than we expected out of this past weekend system. So it's just been busy. There's always been another system on the horizon here, but at least looking down at this picture, we don't see some big, low pressure system spinning just off Washington or Oregon, ready to kind of careen into the area, accompanied with winter weather advisories, winter storm warnings, flood watches, advisories, etc. So somewhat quiet here today. If we're going to get really nitpicky, right, let's look well off the coast of the U.S. here, well out into the Pacific here, actually north of Hawaii. You can see this, what's very likely an upper level trough. You can just get the kind of cloud field moving in this direction. You can see this low pressure system here, indicative with these kind of counterclockwise spinning winds and the clouds there. So dealing with some sort of trough well off the coast. We'll have to kind of account for that, see where that's going in the forecast, but that's pretty far away. So nothing kind of immediate in terms of disrupting the weather this week. Might be finally starting to enjoy some nice extended stretches of weather here. I'll take a look at the forecast in just a few slides, but at least right now, nothing imminent on the horizon to ruin the weekend. Jumping over, this is the year-to-date accumulated precipitation for Santa Barbara, California. It's an area I mentioned, just this past weekend we got, I think, a little bit more rain than was forecast, an area that's been very busy with flooding this year, higher in the upper elevations of the mountain, just receiving tremendous water. And this graphic here shows us the year-to-date precip for Santa Barbara and that kind of blue shaded area, which has been above average. That's what that blue shading actually indicates. The average, accrual or accumulation of rainfall for Santa Barbara would be this black curved line. You can see that not a lot of precipitation happening in normal years over those summer months, which is where we're heading into quickly. But we're well over average. In fact, the end of this year-to-date accumulation line is the normal amount of annual rainfall for Santa Barbara. That's about just over 20 inches, and we're well over that now. 24 inches of rainfall just this year. By mid-April, we've reached our annual level and then surpassed it here in parts of Southern California. And that's consistent across a lot of these south central coastal areas, the Central Valley in some locations, even a little bit further south in the Los Angeles area. Look above, this is just kind of an analysis of those upper level or those jet stream level winds. And we were kind of trying to deduce, based on that visible satellite imagery, where those kind of upper level troughs were, where the jet stream might be. Again, if we look north of Hawaii, which is hard to see on the screen here, well to the bottom of the graph, there's that strong upper level trough, the associated low pressure system we just talked about in that cloud field there. Again, well offshore here of North America, just south of Alaska there. If we look over closer toward the west, we do see this upper level trough a little bit weaker, really kind of positioned across Idaho and Montana. That's bringing those colder temperatures into the area here today, Wednesday afternoon, bringing the snow showers as well. Areas to the south of that trough, though, without being kind of under its influence, California, Nevada, Arizona, dealing with warmer temperatures here on Wednesday afternoon. Take a closer look. This is just the current radar here across Wednesday afternoon for Montana, particularly Northwest Montana, the Golden Triangle, Great Falls area, seeing some snow showers here as that air mass moves in and comes over some of the slight elevation changes here. Kind of look across some other kind of snow and rain showers here percolating across far western Montana into Idaho, maybe northeast or eastern Idaho here as well. But this is really kind of the only clouds and weather to talk about across the western U.S. on this Wednesday afternoon. Temperature-wise, these are the highs valid today on Wednesday as well. Colder across Montana, like we expected, but you go west of that, you go south of that, Nevada, California, southern Arizona, the lower Colorado River Valley, talking mid-90s in some of these desert locations, talking low 80s, high 70s across much of California here. So a pretty spring-like day as we get into mid-April here. Looking ahead, this is the ECMWF forecast, and I'll take this out through the weekend here so we can get an idea of where's that trough going, that big one that we just looked at across the Pacific. What about that weak trough that we were just looking at across Montana? I'll make this forecast valid here as a Wednesday afternoon, kind of right when I'm recording this video. And this lines up here. We saw that big upper level trough across the Pacific. We saw that weak upper level trough here across Montana, bringing the colder temperatures into Montana and those snow showers. I'm going to take this forecast through Wednesday night into Thursday. You can see that trough over Montana now pushing further east over the Dakotas, parts of southern Canada. Not too much to talk about in terms of the western U.S. Can see maybe just something of a very small blip or shortwave trough here sneaking under California, not expected to create much weather down in that area. That upper level trough, at least here on Friday evening, getting into Saturday morning, still well offshore of Oregon and Washington, but there is this lobe, or what we might call a shortwave trough, getting a little bit closer, encroaching toward Washington and Oregon on Saturday midday. If I take the forecast forward, you can see that weakening, but coming over Washington, northern Idaho, and Montana, going through the day Sunday, and then into Monday, pushing down through eastern Montana, and then east of the Divide as well. That's kind of a pivot point here, so expecting maybe some inclement weather to move through parts of Washington, maybe far northern Oregon, and parts of northern Idaho and Montana, but that was a pretty weak trough there that we just saw sneak into the area. If we go further out into the next week, this is the forecast from just the ECMWF model run. We can see some troughing here forecasted west of California. If I take the forecast into the 23rd of April, that's Tuesday, out to the 24th, Wednesday, you can see either some sort of cutoff low pushing into parts of Washington and Oregon here, maybe another piece of this down through California. Just general troughiness here out in that 7-day forecast now. So maybe something to watch as we go through the mid-work week next week in terms of increased precipitation across parts of the far western region, potentially bringing temperatures down a little bit as the system comes in. But this isn't, the strongest kind of trough that we've talked about this year. In April, they do get a little bit predictably more weak, and it's certainly not a big, Pacific jet extension, anything of that nature. Perhaps certainly something on the radar, literally and figuratively, going out through the work week next week. If you get a different opinion here, this is just from the GFS. Let's see what it thinks as far as that next work week. Make this forecast go through Friday into Saturday, very consistent with what we just saw from the ECMWF, that very weak system just kind of skirting, maybe through Washington, northern Oregon, and Montana. That's consistent with what we just saw from the European model. All the while, not much to talk about for the rest of the western U.S. So expecting a pretty nice weekend for areas kind of south of Washington or northern Idaho, northern Montana. Warmer spring-like temperatures, less precipitation, a nice weekend that we can actually enjoy across the area here. But if you kind of look further west, you can see that it is in something of an agreement with that European model that we're going to see some sort of trough here across the eastern Pacific pushing in sometime around midweek. This forecast now valid as of Wednesday morning. This GFS forecast is actually a little bit more potent in terms of this upper level trough, positioned more just off kind of the Bay Area of California. This would bring more inclement weather, precipitation, upper level elevations receiving some snowfall kind of in this corridor here. So definitely something to watch about 6 to 7 days from now. Coming through midweek. A little bit of a disagreement in terms of maybe the exact focus of it, but chances are certainly heightened for some sort of quick hitting system coming through next week. Take the forecast even a little bit further beyond that. There has been some signal that we could be lingering some troughiness over the western U.S. through next weekend, which could try to bring temperatures down just a little bit, at least areas underneath the precip or underneath the cloudiness associated with these troughs. But again, not the biggest trough. Not this kind of big long wave trough that's pulling a lot of Canadian or Northeast Pacific air that might introduce frost risk. At least at this point, not really seeing that from this trough here, although we are getting further out into the forecast where that confidence and our certainty is going to drop quite a bit as we get out beyond 7, 8, and then 9 days into next weekend. If we look at the 7-day temperature anomaly forecast just from the ECMWF model that we reviewed a few slides ago, pretty consistent forecast here that the northern states looking a little bit cooler temperatures. One, we have the trough lingering here today. That's bringing those temperatures down to Montana. With that quick hitting system skirting across Washington, northern Idaho, Montana, that's going to keep temperatures down here Sunday and the next few days after that. But to the south of that, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, lower Colorado, River Valley, looking at above average temperatures here as we go through the next 7 days and maybe even beyond that as well. If we look at the precipitation anomalies going out for 7 days here, this is excluding what's falling here just today. Well below average for the next 7 days, really across the western U.S. Maybe looking at some light precipitation moving through parts of Washington, northern Idaho, but not really enough to register on the departure from average map that we're looking at here. I think maybe jumping over and looking at that kind of absolute total precip forecast, not just the departure or relative to average map. You can see really not much, talking very light, maybe insignificant amounts through the 7-day forecast. That's out to Wednesday of next week. That's about when we're expecting the next system to come on shore, maybe somewhere across the west, bringing more precipitation. At least before that system gets here, not talking about much significant precip across the west, certainly not this weekend for areas further south than Washington or parts of Idaho or northwest Montana. I will show you the forecast precipitation. We've been looking at these forecasts, this sort of map a lot this year, but increasingly there's going to be less precipitation to talk about here until we maybe get into the monsoon season. This forecast is valid as of Wednesday afternoon here, and we can see those light snow showers that we just talked about in northwest Montana, parts of eastern Idaho, northwest Montana, or Wyoming, I should say. Other than that, south and west, not much on the map here. That's consistent with what we just saw from visible satellite imagery, where there was really almost no clouds, across the west here this afternoon. If we take that forecast out into the future, not much on the proverbial radar here through Friday, then Saturday. As we push into very early Sunday morning, kind of overnight, Saturday night, see the first round of precipitation expected from that weak trough that's sneaking into the area here, but really not even seeing much significant precip sneaking into the Willamette Valley here from this on Sunday. That pushes through the area, pushes kind of through the Colorado Rockies without much fanfare, not even a significant amount of snowfall pushing into Idaho or western Montana. And then that really exits out of the Continental Divide into the central and eastern U.S. as we go through the day on Monday. And then back to pretty clear, warmer temperatures across the western region, some warm up here across those northern states that had the cool down from the weekend system. And then maybe getting into Wednesday of next week, seeing some sort of precipitation trying to move onshore somewhere across the western region. The CCMWF model putting more of a focus maybe on this area here. We saw the GFS was more focused maybe on Northern California and Southern Oregon. Regardless, expecting some system to come through midweek, and then the CCMWF model run pushing another system through potentially on Thursday night into Friday. This is even too far out. I wouldn't say this is a bona fide forecast at this point because it's 7-8 day forecast, maybe even a 9 day if we take it out further into to Friday here. So can't put too much confidence in this forecast. What we can say is that Wednesday of next week, likely looking at some sort of precipitation coming onshore, maybe in California, Oregon, Washington, as the trough looks to develop in the eastern Pacific. If we look at the ECMWF ensemble, this incorporates a number of different solutions just to kind of give us some perspective on what we're looking at out into next week. If you look at that 500 millibar height anomaly map, this is looking at the end of next week in through the weekend of going all the way out kind of into late April here, all the way out to April 27th. You can see that general troughiness here across the western coastline. What I mean by that is you can just see this kind of valley here and those upper level heights indicating some troughiness here across the western U.S. That would bring in some precipitation chances, bring the temperatures down just a bit here across the western U.S. So there is agreement here from the ensemble forecast that we're looking at some sort of inclement weather mid to late week next week. And just out of curiosity, if we try to push that forward a bit, see that general troughiness maybe encroaching or entrenching itself across the western U.S., which would bring temperatures down a bit as we go, even into next weekend, perhaps a little bit after that as well. We'll look at the long-range forecast in just a few slides. Look at the ECMWF. This is the ensemble precipitation departures from average It's a 5-day kind of rolling window, and I've taken it out to the end of the next work week and then through that weekend as well. So kind of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday of next week. And you can see kind of general increased precipitation here across some of the states here in the West. Not the strongest signal. Again, this isn't the biggest trough that we've seen come in, but there's at least that signal there in some of these long-range models. One other forecast I wanted to show you here. This is the ECMWF AI forecast run. I've shown you their deterministic model quite a bit over the last videos I made. Almost every video I make, you're going to see me show the ECMWF forecast because it's kind of the flagship weather predicting model that we have available to us. But the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, that's the ECMWF, they have a new AI model that they've disseminated. I haven't shown it yet. It really came out kind of, I think, about 2 months ago. I haven't shown it because we've been kind of validating it, making sure it's ready for production level weather forecasting. And it seems to be doing a good job, especially kind of in that 7 to 8 day range when things tend to start forking left or right or pivoting in terms of a drier or wetter forecast. And so it's kind of another opinion we can get on some of the forecasts, certainly out into next week. So I'll take this forecast out here. This is that trough that we were just talking about, positioned over Montana. Now into Friday of this week, Saturday, Sunday, you can see that weak trough starting to push through Washington, Idaho, Montana. This solution from the AI forecast has it pushing a little bit further north into parts of British Columbia and Alberta, keeping it a little bit out of the influence area for parts of Washington, Oregon, maybe central Idaho. So this would be even a warmer forecast, you'd think, for the western U.S. through the weekend. And then into next week, has that potent upper level trough that we talked about positioned more over British Columbia. It has this kind of weaker lobe of it, so what I was trying to say there, pushing through me through Southern California and Arizona, but not expecting any significant precip out of a weak trough like that pushing through. And then maybe late in the week, maybe more of a trough settling in across the western U.S., bringing temperatures down here across Southern California, Nevada, Arizona. This orientation likely wouldn't produce a big frost risk, just the way this trough is materializing here. But nonetheless, we've seen this kind of consistent forecast from these long-range models, trying to keep some troughing around the western U.S., cooler temperatures, particularly for some of these southern states, in toward next weekend. And this is just another model that's kind of joining that train. Look at the 6 to 10 day precipitation outlook. This is for the work week next week. You can see that kind of general area here across California, Nevada, maybe parts of western Arizona with above average precipitation, drawing here from the Climate Prediction Center. Not, the strongest forecast you'll see from them. So it's not a huge rain event that we're expecting, just some general precipitation pushing into the area. Take that 6 to 10 day forecast and push out to the 8 to 14 day precip outlook. You can see a wider area of increased precipitation out through next weekend expected across the western region. I think that's consistent with that troughing trying to settle into the area, which would keep some showers, clouds lingering through the area and affecting the weather a little bit longer into late April here. If we take the forecast even beyond that, this is from the ECMWF weeklies. They have performed, I've been showing them because they've been performing, I think, pretty admirably this winter. Anytime you have like a 30-day forecast, right, anything beyond 7 days, we start to lose confidence. Certainly a 30-day forecast, we're really kind of looking at any sort of signal just to use as a benchmark. These forecasts have been shifting drier for the western U.S. kind of for a few weeks now. This is looking out from April 22nd out to May 22nd, and that dry signal continues across the western U.S. with less precipitation expected as we go through May here. If we look at the temperature forecast, it's a little bit cooler, so drier and a little bit cooler. I don't think that's inconsistent with some of the seasonal forecasts we've seen here for early summer. One thing we've talked about maybe in the central U.S., not a western U.S. forecast, but a central U.S. forecast, is more severe weather across the central plains, maybe the Corn Belt as well. And one way to get that is a lot of snowpack out west that we've seen. We've talked about that, certainly in kind of the southern states, the Sierra Nevadas, the Colorado River Basin. There's a lot of excess snowpack here, and that can influence more general troughiness, more of these valleys in the jet stream over the western U.S. We saw that in that kind of 7 to 10 day forecast. Remember how I was saying there's that general troughiness trying to set up and entrench itself, at least over these southern states here. When you get troughs over the western U.S., that's a huge severe signal for the central plains or for the central U.S. as well. That's what helps to collide these air masses together, where you bring the dry air from parts of the desert southwest and northern Mexico. You bring down that cold Canadian air mass as well, and then you bring up the warm, moist air mass from the Gulf of Mexico. And these ingredients combine over the central U.S., and you get severe thunderstorms, hail, wind, and tornado reports out in the areas we expect them: Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Illinois, etc. But one thing that would likely be true with that sort of setup is these troughs across the western U.S., which would bring in more clouds, maybe more showers, and generally cooler temperatures across the western U.S., like we're seeing in some of the long-range forecasts, like we're seeing even here in this ECMWF temperature forecast out through May 24th, with these colder temperatures here maybe across California, Oregon, Idaho, southern Arizona as well. Something we looked at last week from the ECMWF seasonal forecast going out into the summer months was a slower, at least with that April forecast update, a slower progression of La Niña. Not necessarily saying La Niña wouldn't happen, but it might develop a little bit more slowly, and perhaps that decreases the chances of us getting into a moderate or strong La Niña. If we just look at some of these other La Niña forecasts here, right now a lot of these percentages, around 60 to 70% of La Niña developing before the next water year, or at least going into the next water year. This forecast from the Columbia IRI Institute here places that number about 70% of La Niña development between September, October, and November, kind of going right into the next water year. The Climate Prediction Center from NOAA, they're a little bit more aggressive, so their forecasts are anywhere from 80 to 90% over that same time frame. I'm a little bit more leaning on the lower chances, just based on some of the things we've seen from past La Niñas and El Niños. I still think it's higher than 50%. I think it's more likely than not, if you will, that we're in a La Niña to end the year, just maybe not so confident that we are in a La Niña. These kind of ENSO El Nino versus La Niña forecasts are difficult, and they're never quite as we expect. And so I never have too much confidence in any of these forecasts, which always puts me maybe closer to 50 to 60% confidence than anywhere from 80 to 90%, certainly a few months out in the forecast, like we're talking with the September, October, or November conversation. I'm maybe at about 60, 65% confidence, so maybe you could put me about like that. This IRI model maybe a little bit more aggressive towards 70%, the Climate Prediction Center more aggressive, 80 to 90%. Regardless, we're in a La Niña watch here, so expecting that to develop here at some point at the end of the year. It could not develop, right? 30% chances occur, all the time. Flip two coins, and if they both come up head, you've achieved it. So, the chances are there that we could be in an ENSO neutral. I think it's pretty unlikely we're back into an El Nino next year. That's consistent with these forecasts here, where the El Nino probabilities are about 5% for next water year. You don't see those chances hit all the time, a 1 in 20. Jump over and look at the just the El Nino indices here. As we've seen really since January, that El Nino has been weakening. That's been the expectation, that we're going to drop into ENSO neutral here at some point going into early summer. This line, or index, if you will, since January, very slowly coming down. We've seen this more aggressive weakening just over the last 14 days or so. In fact, if we kind of get past this half-degree line, that's when we get into this ENSO neutral range, and we're right about there. In fact, just some recent warm-up here in those Pacific Ocean temperatures probably keeping us in a very weak El Nino for another week or two. But regardless, getting into ENSO neutral, about to say goodbye to El Nino, whether we drop, a tenth of a degree or not, semantics. We're really kind of pushing toward that ENSO neutral, which we'll achieve here this summer. The question then becomes, is this steep weakening going to continue, such that we're in a moderate to strong La Niña at some point here over the summer? Or does it stay more around neutral as we get toward the next water year? That's where that kind of forecast pivots on. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that through the summer months here. If we jump over and look at those sea surface temperature anomalies from the Central Pacific here, we're really kind of looking at this area here along the equator. That's this middle line running through the middle of the screen. Temperatures here still warmer than average, kind of right in this region here. Again, that half degree or 1 degree Celsius above average, so still in a weak El Nino looking at these temperatures. But we can see temperatures starting to cool off here in the Eastern Pacific. If you really look right along the equator, some of these temperatures starting to push toward that average or neutral status here. So slowly watching this weekend. Another area I'm focused on, if you look to the north of the equator, kind of off the coast of California and northwest Mexico, see these colder ocean temperatures lingering here south of Alaska, west of California, west of Mexico. That's a negative PDO signal, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. We've been in a negative PDO for a number of years here since the turn of the decade, that is 2020. That makes sense. We call it the Pacific Decadal Oscillation because it tends to reverse on these decadal cycles. So it stays around for quite a while. It will weaken. It will get stronger in some years. That amplification can be important for the forecast. But right now, seeing that negative PDO start to show up again, and that tends to coincide with more La Niña events. So as we're seeing the temperatures here cool or turn blue on this map, that tends to coincide with the development of La Niña as well. Those two things often act in concert as temperatures warm up north of Hawaii, and seeing those warm temperatures still there north of Hawaii. So seeing some La Niña things, seeing some negative PDO things. We're not there yet, but the fingerprints of a negative PDO and La Niña are starting to show themselves, which poses some drought risk, not only for the central U.S., but for parts of the western U.S. as well, like we saw at the beginning of this decade in years like 2020, 21, and 22 as well. If we look at those PDO indices just over the last kind of 4 to 5 years here, really, like I said, the start of the decade here is right about here on this graphic, and we've been in that negative PDO really since then. Now, I mentioned La Niña, we tend to coincide with these negative PDOs. El Nino tends to, as you might imagine, correlate with a positive PDO signal. And as fact, as we went through the year last year in 2023, we saw that negative PDO signal weaken. But here in March and April, watching potentially for a reversal here, which would likely coincide with that La Niña development, which is still expected. We just talked about those forecasts going forward here. So kind of two things I'm watching. Those negative PDO events tend to coincide with maybe a little bit cooler coastal temperatures across the western U.S., but can promote these kind of persistent upper level ridges across other areas in the west that increases temperatures. We typically see that associated sometimes with wildfire risk late in the year, because it just prevents more systems coming in. We talked about El Nino kind of bringing momentum into the equation, keeping these rain systems coming through. Always a weekend, rainmaker to talk about. When you lose that El Nino, you lose that momentum. Then you're not seeing as many rainfall events through those winter months, and that's how we develop drought and can develop it quickly across the western U.S. when we miss out on our window to get a lot of our precipitation. Just that's how things work in the western U.S. If we look at just La Niña and El Nino over the last 20 years here, since this is 2020, I'm circling here. Since 2020, we've been in a La Niña for 3 years. Last year warmed up into an El Nino. Right now, indications are we're definitely coming out of this El Nino here in the summer. Do we come back into a La Niña? I think that's the question. I think 1 year you could, at least in a recent kind of memory sense compared to this year, might be 2020, in the sense that we were coming out of a very weak El Nino, but certainly not a La Niña, and weakening into a La Niña that year in 2020. And I say that because if you look at ocean temperatures from April and May of 2020, pull that up here from May 1st of 2020, these look similar to me to what we just looked at here in April of 2024. We see this kind of weak La Niña signature here across the equator, similar to what we were just circling here a few slides ago. If we look in that PDO area, see some of those colder temperatures developing there north of Hawaii. You see this North Pacific warmth. This just kind of has that developing La Niña look to it in 2020. Another thing 2020 had that's similar to this year is the Atlantic warmth over here east of the Western Hemisphere here. So if I compare that, I'll pull this over and just kind of compare the two. If you look closely, you can see some similarities in this kind of negative PDO signature. Switching back to the 2020, see some similarities there. If you look at the kind of weekly developing La Niña, can see some similarities there, maybe a little bit more advanced in May of 2020. Something that we saw in those years, particularly 2020 and 2021, was drought development across the Four Corners region, across the western U.S. And if we look at the ECMWF seasonal forecast for July, August, and September across the western region, we see that Four Corners drought signal as well in that seasonal forecast. This is something we talked about last week, that weaker monsoon signal across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah as well. If we look at July to September in 2020, these are precipitation anomalies in 2020, the year that we think may be similar to this year. Seeing less precipitation in 2020 in that kind of monsoon Four Corners region to end the summer and to begin fall in those areas, actually extending up across the continental divide. Again, jumping over and looking at that seasonal forecast here for 2024 over the summer, same kind of area of concern here across the western U.S. If we look at the forecast for temperatures here, we talked about this last week, more heat forecasted right now from the ECMWF for the Four Corners region up the continental divide. That's a concern as well. And if we look at July to September of 2020, we saw a lot of heat in the Four Corners region as well, actually expanding west over toward California and Nevada. I'm not as concerned about this year in 2024. There's some important differences. One, 2020, we were coming out of a very weak El Nino. We were actually dealing with drought in January and February in some of those areas. That wasn't the case this year. In fact, it was the exact opposite. So we've had a lot of snowpack. We've had a lot of rainfall in this area. And I'd be less concerned about intense heat or wildfire risk. 2020 was a huge wildfire year for California, but we didn't have a lot of the water that we had at this point. So at least in terms of the comparison here, I'm looking more over the Four Corners region up the Continental Divide to see how far that heat and drought develop. And one reason I keep saying the Four Corners, that's an area of concern, is if you just look at the drought monitor here, valid as of April 11th last week, you can see Four Corners area already dealing with some drought development here in mid-April. So drought, it's sticky, it's sneaky. Where it persists now is a concern for later. So areas where it's already kind of entrenched, we could expect further development in a lot of cases. And that kind of is lining up with that seasonal forecast we just saw from the ECMWF. It's lining up with what we just saw in that comparison to 2020, looking at a weaker monsoon season here at the end of summer, potentially drought concern, expanding from the Four Corners region, perhaps up the Continental Divide if these forecasts hold true. Seasonal forecasts, I probably heard me mention it last week. They're not perfect. Right now it's something of a risk, a concern, but not something we can put all our weight into. But it is a signal that's lining up on a number of these different forecast tools that we have. Last thing as I finish up here, I do send out a weekly weather report. I know some of you are signed up for this, but if you haven't, you can go to this link up here at the top. It's in the description below. I think there's a QR code at the end of the video that I put up as well. You can scan with your phone. If you don't want to do that, it's easier, I think, to click the link in the description. But you'll get kind of the email PDF version for free of what this video is and what we talk about free to your email. So if you want to sign up for that, feel free to, and you'll get a report every Thursday morning, which would be tomorrow morning early, as you start your day to stay up to date on some of these updates, what's happening in La Niña, and any kind of frost risks, and the general forecast over the next 7 to 10 days and beyond. With that, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you all next week.